Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for attending this webinar. It's a pleasure to have you here this afternoon. My name is Claudia Pedrero. I'm a lawyer at Iler Campbell, and I'm also a member of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, where I've sat on the board of directors of the charitable arm of the organization for a few years. So I'll be talking about community land trusts today, both from my perspective in my work as a lawyer, but also as a person involved with the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. So here we are, community land trusts, everything you wanted to know, what they do, how they're formed, and considerations for starting a CLT. So here's a brief agenda of what the presentation is going to address. I'm going to start off by giving an introduction to the community, to what community land trusts are and what they do, because even though there's actually a long history of community land trusts, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, they're a fairly new idea in Canada. So I think it's worth addressing what these types of organizations do, and I'll provide some snapshots of them. Then we'll go on to talk about some core considerations for forming a CLT, and I'll highlight some important points, but mostly illustrate the core considerations by taking a snapshot of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and how it has applied these key concepts of community land trusts to the particular situation that it faces in the neighborhood. Then before we finish, I'll leave you with some CLT resources for those that want to continue reading about this type of organization after the presentation, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions. And I should note that these slides and a recording of the presentation are going to be available on the Iler Campbell website after the presentation. Before we dive in, it's important that I take some time to note that during this presentation I'll be able to provide legal information, but won't be able to provide legal advice. So please keep that in mind when you're asking questions at the end of the presentation. If it's something that would require me to provide some legal advice, I unfortunately won't be in a position to do so now. So let's get started. What is a CLT? So a community land trust in general terms is a nonprofit community-based corporation that's committed to permanent housing affordability and the stewardship of land. Most CLTs focus on housing affordability challenges, and others extend their activities to providing community benefits such as commercial spaces for nonprofits or community urban agriculture spaces. The focus of most CLTs is to acquire land, hold it, sometimes develop it, and to make sure that that land serves a social purpose. The perpetual affordability piece of a CLT is very important. Permanently affordable housing that is outside the private market helps protect against the displacement of low-income residents from neighborhoods that are facing rapid upscaling. When land values rise, low-profit land use tends to get pushed out of a community, and it's expensive to get that low-profit land use back in. So ownership of land by a community land trust removes the land from the speculative market and from the pressures of rising real estate costs. There isn't a single ownership model for community land trusts. I think that's one of the things to keep in mind when thinking about community land trust formation is that there really isn't one model. Some community land trusts operate on a dual ownership model, basically separating the ownership of land from the ownership of buildings. And the buildings can then be sold to individual homeowners while the community land trust retains ownership of the land itself. But the CLTs that focus on rental housing tend to retain ownership both of land and buildings while leasing to operating partners who manage the site on a day-to-day basis. It's important to point out that most CLTs involve a level of community control over the land. That is, the people who live around the CLT, its tenants, the people who use the land, and partner organizations will have a role in the decision-making body of the CLT. And land owned by a CLT is most often the result of a multi-stakeholder partnership involving different levels of government, lenders, community donors, and partner organizations. So the network of a CLT is often very important to its success. Here's a snapshot of CLTs in Canada, and even though we don't have very many of them, there are about 20 at the moment, they do have a long-standing history in the United States where there are over 250, and as well as the United Kingdom. The community land trusts in Canada, the earliest of them were established by the cooperative housing organizations over 30 years ago, but there's been a renewed interest in the model over the past few years, particularly focused on the ability of the community land trust to provide perpetual affordable housing. The community land trust is a fairly new idea in Canada, which can pose some challenges to CLTs that are trying to start up because there aren't a lot of resources available, and the network among community land trusts isn't very well developed. But in 2017, the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts came together for the first time, and they've just recently launched their website. And the purpose of this organization is to serve as a knowledge-sharing forum for CLTs across Canada, sharing information about governance models, development opportunities, funding. And I'm going to provide a link to their website in the resources section later for those who want to connect to the network. So next, as part of introducing CLTs, it's important to talk about the two main types of CLTs in Canada, community-led CLTs and the sector-led CLTs. So community-led CLTs are basically grassroots organizations formed by residents and local organizations that are particularly concerned about the affordable housing needs of a specific community. Most community-led CLTs have a strong focus on democratic governance and community control of land. That is, the people that live in the geographic area of the community land trust are heavily involved in the decision-making body, and essentially there's accountability built into the governance model of the community land trust. And I'm going to give some snapshots of different CLTs operating both in the United States and in Canada. The first example I'm going to talk about is the Champlain Housing Trust, which is probably the largest and most successful community-led CLT out there. It was formerly called the Burlington Community Land Trust, and it's one of actually the largest homeowners in that area, with a very diverse portfolio of rental, for-sale homes, cooperatives, and commercial spaces. And when I say for-sale homes, the CLT operates on what's called a dual ownership model, where the community land trust owns the land and they sell the house on top of it to individual families. There's some assistance for low-income families to purchase homes, and but then the community land trust supports itself financially by recovering some of the increased equity in the resale properties. So this is an interesting model because you see the separation of the land from the buildings, with the land kept by the community land trust, making sure it's used for affordable housing purposes, while the homes are being owned by individuals. The Hamilton Community Land Trust here in Ontario was formed in 2014 by residents of the Beasley neighborhood in Hamilton, and some community-based organizations. And they saw a real need for some greater community control over land use and revitalization of this area, which was facing some rapid upscaling and rising housing prices. So the land trust mandate is to acquire and steward land to facilitate its use for affordable housing and other community needs. In 2017, the City of Hamilton donated a vacant parcel to the CLT, who partnered with Habitat for Humanity to build a 4-bedroom home, which earlier this year was provided to a lower-income family on a long-term lease. And the last example of a community-led CLT I wanted to touch on is Hogan Valley Society, which is an organization in Vancouver organized by members of Vancouver's Black community, and it's seeking to address the historical displacement of the Black community from the area around the Georgia and Dunsmuir Viaduct, which was a result of an urban renewal program of the city. And the organization is right now in negotiations with the City of Vancouver over a proposal for a nonprofit community-led land trust that would steward the land around the Georgia Dunsmuir Viaduct and oversee the development of affordable housing and cultural amenities. And the city is committed to negotiating for either a land trust, a long-term lease, or another mechanism for that land. So now that I've gone over the community-led examples, we're going to touch on the sector-led CLTs in Canada. Sector-led community land trusts generally originate and are controlled by a segment of the nonprofit housing sector. In Canada, I mentioned this earlier, the first CLTs were established by the cooperative housing sector, and this was primarily done as a means to preserve the affordability of housing, but also preserve the resources in co-ops that were isolated in different areas. And these organizations have also functioned as a development arm of the cooperative housing sector. Some key features of this type of CLT is that they're usually controlled by a single organization. They have a development focus, a limited membership, but they've been able to harness some great capacity much more quickly than community-led CLTs in Canada, and they've been making some great successes in recent years. So here's a snapshot of some different sector-led CLTs. The first is the Community Land Trust in Vancouver, which was an initiative of the Cooperative Housing Federation of British Columbia, and this organization has developed over, I believe it's over 2,600 units across different properties in BC, so both inside Vancouver and outside. And the unique aspect of this organization is that it's taken a portfolio approach to properties by holding various properties and leasing them to providers who operate the rental properties, and being able to have a variety of rents on those properties, ranging from almost market rent to shelter rates, the organization has been able to cross-subsidize its properties, being able to basically offer deeper levels of affordability on many of its properties. And then Homespace in Calgary is probably the largest nonprofit housing developer in the area, which currently owns 26 properties and operates 521 housing units, and they also provide property management services. And an interesting aspect of this organization and the way it operates is its partnerships with just over 15 organizations over all of its different sites, and these organizations provide supportive housing services to the residents of the properties that Homespace owns. So now I'm going to move on to talking about community land trust formation and some of the core considerations for establishing a CLT, keeping in mind that every CLT is organized to address specific local contexts and objectives. So every CLT is going to vary in its approach and scale. In addition to not having a single model, it should be clear that CLTs focus on land ownership, ensuring its permanent affordability and stewardship for the betterment of a community. And many have democratic governance structures that emphasize community control. I'm now going to go over some of the important elements for establishing a CLT, and I'm going to highlight a few of them, but I think the most important ones are listed here. So I'm going to go over a few of these, but rather than go through all of them, I'm going to use the example of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and how it has applied these considerations to its particular context. So I think probably the first step and the most important step in the formation of the CLT is to figure out what it's going to do. It's important to know whether the core purpose of the CLT is going to be to protect and preserve existing affordable housing or to create new affordable housing. And the type of neighborhood that the CLT is located in is going to help guide that decision. Some of the neighborhoods may have existing affordable housing stocks that are in decline, while others may not have much of that stock to begin with. And identifying the sites will help focus on the type of household that the CLT can serve, which in turn informs the type of outreach and capacity building that is going to be necessary. And the last part about understanding the housing market, particularly for community-led CLTs, is to understand from who the CLT can acquire its properties. This is particularly important for a community-led CLT that might need a flexible approach to and look at various different sources of various different types of landowners. For example, purchasing from individual private vendors or even receiving donations of land from value-aligned landowners in the area may be an option. Looking at government and municipally owned land owned by other organizations as well. And it's worth noting that understanding the type of donor market is also a key to knowing the type of education and outreach that they are going to require as well, because remembering that this type of model is still new to many. So tailoring that outreach to donors is also going to be an important component. The type of organization that a land trust chooses is going to be important. And as I mentioned earlier, most CLTs incorporate as nonprofit organizations but often for community-led CLTs, the question comes up about whether charitable status is needed if the organization thinks it's going to receive donations of money or of land and be expected to provide tax receipts. Some organizations, such as the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, that I'm going to talk about soon, may adopt a dual organization structure that basically has a charity and a nonprofit working together, with the nonprofit able to do activities that the charity may be restricted from doing. And then it's worth considering whether there is an existing organization that has the capacity and risk tolerance to take on the activities of a community land trust. But this question also brings up considerations about whether the current governance structure of the existing organization aligns with the vision of governance for the land trust, as well as what risks would be involved with taking on those activities. And before I start talking about the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, I wanted to go over the consideration of membership and board governance for CLT formation. So again, there's no fixed requirement for community-based membership or directors from the community, but many CLTs do adopt a wide membership that involves community members and have a board that is representative of people that live in the area, the people that use the land, and partner organizations. The goal of this type of board structure is to basically represent the diversity of land-based interests in the community and try to maintain an equitable balance between those competing interests while diffusing power, so there isn't one interest group that can dominate, but everyone has a stake. So now I'm going to transition into talking about the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and how it's applied the considerations that I laid out earlier and integrated them into its structure and operations that are largely a result of the particular context that it finds itself in. So the PLT is a community-led land trust that was established as a response to some rapid changes in the neighborhood around housing affordability and community-owned assets. The land in the Parkdale neighborhood, which is located in Toronto, the land values were rapidly increasing and putting some significant pressure on a neighborhood primarily composed of renters and a large low and middle income community. As I mentioned earlier, rapid increases in land values have a tendency to push out lower profit land use, and this has resulted in some lower income residents relying on the community supports that are already there being displaced from the neighborhood. And the problem that the PLT identified is that there weren't policies or mechanisms in place to protect the existing affordable housing stock in the neighborhood. Once properties were sold and converted to private use, the affordable housing units disappeared, and housing units were being lost at a much faster rate than new housing units were being created. And so the organization was seeded by a number of community consultations. Residents and nonprofit organizations in the area started getting together, and there was some research done on evaluating community ownership in the neighborhood and democratic governance models. And so the organization came together between 2010 and 2013, doing some preliminary research and market analysis, finally incorporating in 2014. And so here we have the purpose, vision, and values of the land trust, which it seeks to reflect in both its governance structure and its activities. So the vision of everyone having the right to participate in local land use planning is reflected in its community planning initiatives. So the PNLT was mandated by its members to provide community benefits in 4 ways. By providing affordable housing, urban agriculture spaces, commercial spaces for nonprofits and small businesses, and engaging in participatory community planning. And this is a brief history of where the PNLT started and where it's gone to until recently. As I mentioned earlier, the PNLT started as a result of some research done by community organizations into the feasibility of this model and the needs of the community. From 2014 to 15, the organization incorporated and started really developing its governance model and spending a lot of time thinking about how the different types of membership that it had and how that was going to be, how it needed to be reflected in the types of people living in the community. In 2017, the organization was registered as a charity and acquired its first property, which is a community garden called the Milky Way Garden, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. And it also really ramped up its efforts in seeking to acquire a rooming house, a residential property, and a type of affordable housing in the neighborhood that was seeing rapid decline. In 2018, the PNLT established a sister organization, which I'll talk about in a few minutes when I talk about the governance structure of the organization. But basically now the PNLT is an umbrella organization for both a charity and a nonprofit organization that further the same goals. And this year, the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust completed its first successful acquisition of a residential property, which was a huge win for the organization, and I'll talk about that property a little bit more soon. So this is an illustration of the governance model of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, and it shows the 2 organizations that make up the land trust. On the right-hand side, we have the not-for-profit organization, which is its legal name is the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. And this organization has a wide membership of community members, and the community for the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust is defined as anyone who works and lives in the neighborhood. There are 4 types of members, and I'm going to go into the membership types in a little while. And it's comprised of a fairly large board of 15 people who are elected by the general membership. And then its sister organization, the Neighborhood Land Trust, is a charity. So it's a separate organization, but it's related in that the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust is the only member of the charity. So the board of the not-for-profit elects the board of the charity. And the reason that a charity, that we have this dual structure is that really out of necessity, the Neighborhood Land Trust realized that it needed to become a charity to acquire its first property, because part of the deal involved providing a tax receipt for part of the value of the property that it was acquiring. And the second property that it owns, the rooming house at 26 Maynard, also needed to be purchased by a charity. So it was necessary for the Neighbourhood Land Trust to have a charitable arm, but Canadian charities law restricts some of the activities of charitable organizations. So, for example, community planning and advocacy activities are restricted for charities. So it was important for a PNLT to be able to do those activities, as well as to be able to partner with organizations that the charity can't. For example, the charity would be restricted from partnering with organizations who aren't charities. So social enterprises, nonprofit, commercial businesses, and basically any other nonprofit who's not a charity. So, for example, if the Neighborhood Land Trust ever wants to own a commercial site, it would likely be owned by the not-for-profit instead of the charity. So that's a bit of background on the governance structure, what it looks like, but also why it looks like it does. And I think it's important to give a snapshot of the size of the organization, because I think what it's done is great, considering its fairly small size. Right now it's composed of 700 members, and it has a fairly robust committee structure that does a lot of work for the organization, everything from governance and policy development to running education and outreach programs, board recruitment, reviewing proposals for acquisitions. That work is often done by committee members. As I mentioned, there are 15 board members, and then there are 4 part-time staff and 2 full-time staff. So I mentioned I was going to talk about the different membership types and why we have those different types of members and their function in the organization. So the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust has technically 4 types of members. We have what are called core members, members who use the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust or the Neighborhood Land Trust's property, either tenants or, in the case of the Milky Way Garden, people who use the garden. So those are core members. Organizational members are representatives nominated by partner organizations. So, for example, the Parkdale Activity Recreation Center operates the site at the rooming house site at 26 Maynard, and they would be able to be a organizational member of the land trust. The third category is community members, and this is open to anyone who lives or works in the neighborhood. And then we have supporter members, which is open to anyone that doesn't fit the above categories, and supporter members are a non-voting class of membership for the organization. So relatedly, the board structure is designed to be representative of
the community and is elected from the membership of the organization. Ideally, there is 1/3 of each core members, organizational members, and community members on the board. But when this is impossible, for example, there aren't enough nominees from each category to fill 1/3 of the spots, it's possible for other member types to fill in when there isn't enough of another member type on the board. And it's important to note that the core membership category is distinct in that core members can only be elected by other core members, and this is done to help ensure there's a stronger voice from them on property use decisions. Like other community-led CLTs, the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust has a focus on community-based decision-making, and this happens through the annual general meeting of the organization, but also through participation by members in visioning sessions for sites, as well as consultation on what the priorities should be for an acquisition. And it's through these types of efforts that PNLT has continuing understanding of the highest and best use of land. And then before I start talking about the two sites that the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust owns, it's important to address the programs and the community-based research and outreach that the PNLT does, because these activities are integral to advancing the purposes of the organization. So in addition to the early research that the organization did around the CLT model, there was mapping of land use in the neighborhood and understanding the needs of the community. The PNLT's programs and research have helped keep it connected to the needs of the community and the people that it wants to serve. In 2016, the PNLT did a 7-month study on rooming houses in the neighborhood to try to understand the impact of gentrification and real estate speculation on rooming house loss in the neighborhood. Because rooming houses in Parkdale represent the largest number of privately owned affordable housing. There are about 2,700 units over 190 properties. So this is a fairly large stock of existing affordable housing that was facing significant pressure to decline as a result of rising real estate values. The result of this study, which confirmed that many of these properties were at risk of disappearing, and that about 350 residents had already been displaced as a result of conversion and upscaling. The result of the study led PNLT to call for a multi-partner preservation strategy and really focus its efforts on demonstrating that this type of affordable housing would be well stewarded by a community land trust. The PNLT also operates the Parkdale Free School, which is run by committee members of the PNLT, and it's an initiative to organize free classes and workshops around the neighborhood that draws and engages the knowledge of community members. So now I'm going to finish off the conversation by talking about the Milky Way Garden, and then go into the rooming house property that the PNLT acquired. So the Milky Way Garden is a garden operated by Tibetan community members who are part of an ESL program at the Parkdale Public Library across the street. And before the PNLT acquired it, this group of gardeners had identified the site. It was vacant. It's about 7,000 square feet. And they talked to the owner and began temporarily using it as a garden. The PNLT was presented with an option to purchase the land and purchase it at a below market price. The Land Trust was able to raise funds both from donations from community members as well as a few grants to complete the purchase of the site in 2017, which was very exciting. So now the Land Trust owns the land and leases it to a nonprofit organization, Greenest City, who operates the land and is responsible for programming and site development. And it's important to note that part of the acquisition process, the PNLT led a community planning process with different resident groups to identify a plan for the site's redevelopment into an urban agricultural hub for the community. And the rendering for that hub is the left photo that's there. And the last point that I wanted to make about the Milky Way Garden is that the people that you see in the photo are now become the core members of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust after once the organization owns the land. So the gardeners of the Milky Way Garden, as well as the residents of the rooming house that the Land Trust acquired, are part of the core member group, and they elect amongst themselves a number of representatives to sit on the board of directors of the Land Trust. So acquisition of the PNLT's first residential property was a culmination of huge efforts to try to take a rooming house out of private ownership in Parkdale. The organization made a number of attempts to secure different sites, but there were many problems with trying to do this. Purchasing properties from the private market is extremely competitive, and as the organization was relying on grant funding to purchase the site, the existing funding programs for affordable housing just wouldn't move fast enough to support this type of acquisition. And most of the programs to begin with were focused on affordable housing creation instead of preservation of existing stock. But the PNLT developed some strong relationships with its local councillor and municipal officials who listened and created a pilot project to fund the acquisition of a site and renovation. So PNLT raised funds from community donations for its down payment for this property, and entered into a purchase agreement with a private seller of a rooming house, and then submitted its application to the city for the remaining acquisition funds, and was thankfully successful. This allowed the PNLT to close on the purchase of 26 Maynard, which is a 15-unit rooming house in Parkdale, and this was closed earlier this year in May. So now the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust owns the land and the building on this site and is able to preserve the existing affordable housing units there and ensure that none of the tenants are displaced. So PNLT owns the land, but it's leased to a partner organization, the Parkdale Activity Recreation Center, who has a strong track record in the neighborhood to operate the site. And so that finishes my discussion about the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and I'm now going to leave you with some resources from all over about community land trusts, and the first of which I mentioned earlier is the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. And these slides will be available later if you'd like to check the URLs. So now we have some time for questions. Thank you everyone for your patience. There are some questions already, but feel free to put them in the little panel to the left here. And I'll read out the questions. The first question is, does the charitable status itself act as an asset lock? Are there other contractual elements beyond simple asset lock text in articles or bylaws? So to answer the first question, no, charitable status doesn't necessarily act as an asset lock, although a charitable organization would likely want to need to sell to another charitable organization. There's other ways of ensuring that land remains affordable. For example, there can be covenants registered on the land that restrict its use. Or for example, the Champlain Housing Trust, when it sells a building to a homeowner, there's a covenant that restricts the resale value of it. So there are other mechanisms that can control and ensure affordability. Worst case scenario, could the assets of the charity be sold off and staff paid out, or could the charity be converted and assets sold? I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but I mean, yes, in a worst case scenario, if the charity isn't able to operate a site, the financial feasibility of the project isn't good, the charity might be in a position of having to divest itself of the assets, but there would be restrictions on the type of organization that it could be sold to, and ideally a community land trust would want to ensure as much as possible that the continuing use of the site is maintained. There's a question about air rights, and unfortunately I think it's the type of question that you would need legal advice for, so I'm unfortunately not going to be able to answer that one for you. The next question is, will it be possible to receive the slides? Yes, they will be posted on our firm's website, and there will be a recording of the slides of the presentation posted as well. The next question is whether the Toronto Islands, so the Toronto Islands are CLTs, are community land trusts as well. That's correct. The city owns the land, leases the property, and the owners own their houses. And the question is, have they provided any support or advice to the new Canadian network? And I'm afraid I actually don't know. As far as I know, I don't believe they're part of the Canadian network of community land trusts, mostly I believe because I believe the Toronto Island Trust doesn't identify itself as a provider of affordable housing, but in terms of how their mechanism works and on a practical level, I think it would be a great idea to engage with them. That's a great point. Next question, aside from Parkdale, are there any other neighborhoods in Toronto that are considering a CLT? So yes, there's the Friends in Kensington Market in Toronto that has formed a community land trust, and they have a website, and you can find them. And other than that, I'm not aware of other community land trusts in Toronto, other than a sector-led community land trust that is owned by the Cooperative Housing Federation of Toronto, and they own, I believe, around 3,000 or 4,000 units, but at different cooperative housing organizations, and this organization has been around for quite a long time. So the next question, a simple model in a community, realistically, how long would it take to establish a CLT entity? I think the answer is, unfortunately, it depends, and it would really depend on the capacity of the community, the degree to which it's organized already, and the knowledge base of different people and organizations in the community already. Because if you have organizations that are already knowledgeable about and engaged with affordable housing, and that's going to be the focus of the land trust, but maybe in a different way from the existing organization, then you already have an existing knowledge base to draw from. So I think it's a matter of how quickly your community can put together the different components. I mean, you saw in the example of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, which was a grassroots effort. It took about 3 years of just research and community consultations to really talk about a model that would work well, and then eventually incorporate in 2014, and then the first property was acquired in 2017. That's just one example, and Parkdale has a history of organizing and people that are extremely involved. So I think that might not be a good benchmark for every community. So the next question is, how do CLTs collaborate, if at all, with other land trusts who are more focused on environmental conservation? Any examples of organizations doing both? So I'm not aware of organizations doing both. I know that there's certainly conversations and awareness of between land trusts that focus on housing versus those that focus on environmental matters, and certainly there are a few conservation-focused land trusts that are turning their attention to affordability matters, but to my knowledge, the collaboration so far has been fairly limited because the goals of the organizations and their activities don't often align. But I definitely think that there's potential for collaborations when you do have values and visions that align with between the two. So next question. Which model, and I think this is actually going to be the last question because we're at the hour mark, which model, organizational driven or organically community established CLT, has proven to be successful and or sustainable in your view? I don't think there is one model that is necessarily more sustainable than another. You have the example of the Champlain Housing Trust in Burlington, which is a community-led initiative that has been extremely successful, but we also have the examples of some very strong successes from the Community Land Trust in Vancouver and Home Space in Calgary. So I think it's more an ability for the Community Land Trust to really understand the needs of a particular community and be able to develop a model that effectively meets those needs while having some financial sustainability. So I think the Community Land Trusts that have been successful are the ones that have been able to adapt to a local context, be innovative, but also find a model that is an operational model that is sustainable. So I think that's it, and I don't see actually any other questions, but if there are some, my email is at the bottom of the last slide, and you're free to email me with any questions that might come up later. And as I mentioned earlier, the slides and a recording of the presentation will be available on the Iler Campbell website shortly after the presentation. So thank you everyone for your time. It's been a real pleasure to do this, and stay in touch. Thanks.